My mother abandoned me at 13. But when I inherited $150K and two businesses, she showed up out of nowhere. Years later, I legally evicted her, and she tried to make me the villain of a story she created herself. I'm 28 years old. I manage two art supply stores that I inherited from my father, and I need to tell this story because my mother showed up out of nowhere after years and almost managed to turn me into the villain of a situation she created herself. I guess I should start at the beginning. When I was 13 years old and my mom, Brenda, decided that our life wasn't good enough for her. I don't remember the exact day, to be honest, but I do remember perfectly when I came home from school and my dad, James, was sitting at the kitchen table with his face in his hands, and there was a note on the refrigerator that basically said Mom had left with a guy named Ryan who had more money and a more exciting life, or something like that, because being the wife of an art store owner and mother to a teenager was apparently too boring for her. My dad never showed me the full note, but I heard enough when he was on the phone with his brother, my Uncle Charles. That night, Brenda was a personal trainer, one of those who work at expensive gyms, and she met Ryan there, a businessman or something who could afford to pay for trips and fancy restaurants and all that shit that we definitely couldn't afford. My dad's art store was small, in a town that wasn't very big either, and things were tight, like always tight, but I thought we were happy, I was happy. Apparently she wasn't. The first few years after she left were brutal. I'm not going to lie. My dad was trying to keep the store running and at the same time be a single father to a teenager who suddenly had a lot of anger and abandonment issues. I helped at the store after school, organized inventory, helped customers when dad had to do orders or go to the bank, that kind of thing. We didn't have much money, and there were times when I thought we were going to lose the store. I literally thought we'd end up living in a tiny apartment and dad working for someone else. But somehow, we made it. He never complained, never spoke badly about Mom in front of me. Although I know he was devastated, I could see it in how he'd stare at old photos when he thought I wasn't looking. When I was like 16, something happened that changed everything. My Uncle Charles, my dad's brother who lived like 3 states away and who we barely saw, died. We didn't have a close relationship with him, honestly, but apparently he did remember us because he left us an inheritance of $150,000. $150,000. Can you believe it? Dad almost fainted when the lawyer called him. I remember he came home that day and hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, and he told me, "We're going to be okay. Casey, your uncle gave us a second chance." And he was right. Dad used that money smartly. He didn't go crazy or anything. First, he paid off all the debts we had. Then he invested in expanding the original store and opening a second location in a bigger neighboring town where there was more traffic and more potential customers. Things improved so much. We weren't rich or anything, but we weren't constantly worried anymore about whether we could pay rent or electricity. When I turned 18, right before going to college, Dad surprised me with something amazing. He gave me an apartment. Well, technically, he bought it as an investment, but he told me it was mine to use while I studied and afterwards if I wanted. It was a small but decent place. Nothing fancy but enough for me. And I was in shock. Like I literally couldn't believe we had the resources to do that. In college, I studied business administration because I always knew I wanted to help Dad with the stores. And things were going well. Really well. Dad was proud of what we'd built together because I kept helping at the stores on weekends and holidays, and we had plans to maybe open a third location at some point. But then, in my last semester of college, when I was 22 and about to graduate, Dad started feeling sick. At first, we thought it was the flu or something, but he wasn't getting better, and I finally convinced him to go to the doctor. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The doctor said it had probably been there for a while, but Dad had ignored the symptoms because he was busy with the stores and me and everything. Everything happened so fast after that I still have trouble processing it. Dad tried treatments, but the cancer was too advanced, and he died literally 2 weeks before my graduation. 2 weeks. I had worked 4 years for that moment, and he couldn't see it. I graduated anyway because he would have wanted me to. But it was the most surreal experience of my life. Being there at the ceremony, knowing that Dad had just died and that he was never going to see my diploma or the photos or anything. Dad left me everything in his will. The 2 art stores, the house where we'd lived, the apartment, some savings accounts, everything. I was 22 years old and suddenly I owned a business with 2 locations. and properties and an amount of responsibility that terrified me. The first few months were a mess. Honestly, I was dealing with grief and trying to learn to manage the stores completely alone and paying bills and dealing with employees and suppliers. And there were nights when I cried, thinking I was going to ruin everything Dad had built. But I had good managers at both stores who helped me a lot, and little by little, I found my rhythm. It wasn't easy. Not at all. But I was surviving. I was managing to keep Dad's business running. And then, like a year after Dad died, when I was 23, my mom showed up. Brenda just appeared one day at the main store, walked in like nothing after 10 years of absolute silence. 10 years where she didn't send a letter or a call or a birthday message or anything, and acted like it was totally normal. She brought a teenager with her, Owen, who turned out to be my half-brother. He was like 15 at the time, and apparently things with Ryan hadn't worked out, they'd separated, and she needed a place to stay for a while she got back on her feet. I was in shock, like literally frozen behind the counter while she talked as if we'd just seen each other last week. She told me she'd found out about Dad's death from someone in town, that she was so sorry she hadn't been there, that it had been hard for her too, and that she needed help. The apartment that Dad had given me was empty at that time because I was living in Dad's house, and she knew that somehow, probably asked around before showing up, and she asked me if she and Owen could stay there temporarily, just until she got a stable job and they could find their own place. I don't know why I said yes. Well, I do know. I felt guilty. You know? Owen wasn't to blame for anything. He was just a kid caught in this situation, and a part of me, a stupid and damaged part, wanted to believe that maybe Mom had changed, that maybe we could have some kind of relationship after all. I told her they could stay, but with conditions. They had to pay the utilities, water, electricity, internet, those things, because I wasn't going to completely subsidize their life. She agreed, hugged me, and told me I was a lifesaver, that she'd never forget this. All that manipulative shit that now I see clearly, but at the time made me feel like I was doing the right thing. The first 2 months were okay, I guess. Owen was a good kid. Quiet, kind of shy, and I tried to connect with him because technically he was my brother even though we barely knew each other. Mom got a job at another gym and acted like she was really trying. But then the problem started. The utility bills came in my name because the property was mine, and Mom always had excuses for why she couldn't pay them that month. That the gym owed her hours, that Owen needed things for school, that her car needed repairs. Everything month after month, excuse after excuse. And I ended up paying everything because I wasn't going to let them cut the electricity or water with Owen living there. After like 6 months of this, I was fed up. I had spent thousands of dollars on utilities that she was supposed to pay, and when I tried to talk to her about it, she'd get defensive or start crying, saying she was a single mother doing her best, as if I didn't know exactly what it's like to grow up with a single parent who actually tries. The last straw was when I found out she was talking to other relatives, distant cousins and people who didn't even talk to me regularly, telling them her version of the story where I was a cruel daughter who had her living in miserable conditions and charged her ridiculous amounts of rent. When the reality was I didn't charge her rent at all. I just asked her to pay the fucking utilities. At that point, I decided enough was enough. I was 24 years old. I had lost my dad, I was managing 2 businesses, and I wasn't going to let this woman who abandoned me as a child manipulate and use me. I hired a lawyer, Mr. Parker, an older guy who had known Dad and who knew the whole story. I explained the situation to him, and he told me that technically Brenda was a tenant even though we didn't have a formal contract, and that I had to follow the legal eviction process. I felt horrible doing it, especially for Owen. But Mr. Parker reminded me that I had no legal or moral obligation to support a woman who had abandoned me a decade ago. We served her the eviction notice on a day when I wasn't there, because I knew I couldn't handle it emotionally. Mom exploded. Obviously. She called me screaming, saying I was an ungrateful daughter, that Dad would be disappointed in me, that I was leaving Owen homeless, basically every emotional button she could push. I told her she'd had months to pay what she owed and find her own place, that I'd given her more chances than she gave me when she left me at 13, and that I wasn't going to continue this conversation. I hung up and cried for hours, but I knew I was doing the right thing. Mom decided to fight the eviction, hired a lawyer too, probably paying him with money she should have used for utilities, and started a full campaign to make me look like the devil. She posted things on social media about single mothers being mistreated by heartless children, without mentioning my name directly, but leaving enough clues for people to know who she was talking about. Some acquaintances from town who didn't know the whole story started giving me weird looks or making comments, and it was shit. Honestly, feeling like I had to defend myself for establishing basic boundaries with someone who literally abandoned me. The court hearing was one of the most surreal and frustrating experiences of my life. Mom arrived dressed like she was going to a job interview, acting all professional and composed, and when it was her turn to speak, she started with the tears. Perfectly timed tears. You know? She told the judge she was a single mother trying to recover after an abusive relationship with Ryan, that I was the only family she had, that she'd made mistakes in the past but was trying to make amends, and that evicting her basically meant leaving her teenage son on the street. She conveniently forgot to mention that she'd left me when I was 13, that she hadn't paid a single utility in 8 months, that she'd been manipulating the family against me, all that. My lawyer, Mr. Parker, was incredible. He presented all the bills I had paid, documentation of all the attempts I'd made to communicate with her about payments, text messages, and emails where she promised to pay and never did. Everything. He also mentioned, quite calmly but with impact, that Brenda had abandoned her underage daughter a decade ago and hadn't had contact until she needed something, which established a pattern of behavior. Mom's lawyer tried to argue that was irrelevant to the current case, but you could see the judge was taking note. When it was my turn to speak, I tried to stay calm even though my hands were shaking. I explained to the judge that I wasn't doing this out of cruelty, that I cared about Owen and didn't want him to suffer, but that setting boundaries didn't make me a bad person. I told him I had tried to help my mom in good faith, that I'd given her a place to live for free except for utilities, and that she had repeatedly abused that generosity. I also mentioned, and this was hard for me to say because I felt a lump in my throat, that my dad had died without her there, that he had fought cancer alone apart from me, and that I had inherited the responsibility of everything he built, and that I wasn't going to let anyone, including my biological mother, destroy that. The judge listened to everything, asked some questions about the length of the stay and the verbal agreements we'd had, and then took like 10 minutes to review the documents. Those 10 minutes felt like hours. I swear. I was sitting there with my heart beating so hard I thought everyone could hear it. Finally, the judge spoke and said that although he understood the situation was complicated from a family perspective, legally the case was clear. I was the owner. I had made reasonable attempts to reach an agreement, and Brenda had failed to comply with the basic conditions of residence. He ruled in my favor and gave Mom 2 weeks to completely vacate the apartment. Mom left the court crying, wrapped her arm around Owen like she was a martyr protecting her son, and threw me a look that honestly gave me chills. She didn't say anything, but she didn't have to. The look said everything. Basically, she was blaming me for ruining her life when she had ruined hers all by herself with her decisions. Owen looked at me too. And that's what hurt the most, because I could see confusion in his eyes. He'd probably only heard Mom's version of this whole story, and didn't understand why his older half-sister was doing this. The 2 weeks were tense. Mom complied with the order, got her stuff out of the apartment, but not without first trying one last dramatic move. She left a note at the store counter, not directly for me, but where any of my employees could see it first, saying something about how real family doesn't give up on each other and that she hoped someday I'd understand the pain of a mother separated from her refuge. One of my managers gave it to me with an uncomfortable face, and I just threw it in the trash without finishing reading it. I'd had enough emotional manipulation for a lifetime. Now I'm 28, 3 years after all that drama, and the stores are doing well. Better than Dad probably imagined. I opened that 3rd location last year, something Dad and I had dreamed about together. And every time I'm there, I feel like somehow he's proud. I rented the apartment to a quiet college student who pays his rent on time and never causes problems. Imagine that. I haven't heard from Mom directly again, but I hear things occasionally around town, that she got an apartment with Owen somewhere else, that she's still working at the gym, that kind of thing. She doesn't look for me, and I don't look for her. And honestly, I'm at peace with that. Sometimes I feel guilty, especially when I think about Owen. He deserves better than what he has. A kid who didn't ask to be born in the middle of all this family chaos. Part of me wonders if I should have done more, endured a little longer, found another solution. But another part of me, the part that remembers being 13 and feeling completely abandoned, I knows I set the right boundaries. I can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved, and I definitely can't support someone who sees my help as a right instead of a gift. Last week, I was organizing some of Dad's old things that I still have stored in the house, and I found a photo from when I was like 10, before Mom left. The three of us were at the original store. Dad was teaching me how to mix paints or something, and Mom was in the background, smiling. For a second, I allowed myself to feel nostalgic for that time when I thought we were a normal, happy family. But then I remembered that photo captures a moment that apparently was only real for Dad and me, not for her, because if it had been real for her, she wouldn't have been able to leave us so easily. I put the photo back in the box and went on with my day. I have orders to review, employees to supervise, a business to keep running. That's my life now. And I built it from the ashes of what Dad left me, without Brenda's help, without needing her approval or her presence, and that's enough for me, I guess.